to be here with you today. And I bring you greetings from our church, Priest Baptist Church in Rochester, New York. And I bring you specific greetings from our region's executive minister, Dr. Sandra Hasenauer, who told us last night to be sure to give you a special greeting from her and to tell you she was sorry her schedule didn't allow her to be here this morning as well. But I'm sure we'll be seeing her as she gets around and is doing a great job. One of my most enduring memories of my childhood, my mother, is her preparing a meal in the kitchen. She was a great cook. And when I was a teenager, we lived in Germany, and I was studying at home. I was they didn't call it homeschooling, but I was taking correspondence courses for my high school work. So I was home all the time. And I was a teenager, so I liked to eat. So I would tend to hang out in the kitchen when she was preparing the meal. And we adopted the European custom of having our big meal in the middle of the day. So that was when she was in her glory, cooking this big meal. And I'd be sitting in the kitchen, and she would be cooking, and she'd have the radio on, Armed Forces Network, we always listen to every day. And at 12 noon, a very distinctive voice would come out on the radio, and it would say, "Stand by for news." Who knows what I'm talking about here? Does that ring a bell to some of you? The distinctive voice of Paul Harvey, who was one of my mom's favorites. She loved listening to his broadcast. And one of the things I remember about his broadcast is he would do these rest of the story features. And he would launch into a story about somebody with details about their life. And you wouldn't know for certain who he was talking about for a while until he would tell the rest of the story. And then there'd be a reveal at the end, and we'd find out who he was talking about all along, and be a little bit enlightened about what that person's life was all about. And I was thinking about that when I was looking at the text for this morning, about Paul Harvey and the rest of the story. And the text for this morning, Luke is telling us about the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Jesus had grown up in relative obscurity. He was apprenticed with his dad, who was a builder. And it wasn't until somewhere around the age of 30 that Jesus began what we think of as his public ministry. And in today's text, Luke gives us the first recorded description of Jesus speaking in the synagogue. And here's Luke's account. When Jesus came to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And Jesus rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all the synagogue were fixed on him. And then he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." That's a nice story, isn't it? The men in the synagogue have gathered, and Jesus has handed the scroll to read, and the men are probably thinking something like, "Oh, look, Joseph's boy is going to speak today. He hasn't ever done this before. Let's see how he does." They're expectant and curious, and they're probably thinking things like, will he speak clearly enough for us to understand? Do you think he's nervous? I sure would be. Glad it's him up there speaking and not me. I hate speaking in front of people. That's probably what's going through their heads. And so Jesus turns to this very familiar passage of Scripture and reads about the coming of Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor. A message of good news on its way for the poor, the oppressed, the sick, all those who suffer. And after that, you would imagine the men would probably have smiled and nodded and gone up to Jesus after the meeting and patted him on the back to congratulate him and tell him how much they enjoyed his little talk. Said maybe he should do it more often, maybe he could be a preacher someday if he kept at it. That's what you might think. And then they would go home for a nice meal and a Sabbath nap. But that isn't the way things go in the story. And in order to really understand what is being revealed here, we have to read, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. Because if you go back to that story and keep reading, we find that it only takes 6 verses for the men in that synagogue to get so angry with Jesus that they drive him out of town and try to throw him off a cliff. Now, I've had some bad responses to sermons, but never one quite that bad. At first, it seems like the reaction in the crowd is just fine. In verse 22, it says, all spoke well of him, of Jesus. They were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. And they said, isn't this Joseph's son? So at first, pretty good. But then something happened that turned the mood of the congregation into an ugly, murderous rage. An angry note of contention takes over the conversation. Jesus says to them, doubtless you'll quote to me the proverb, doctor, cure yourself. And you will say, do here also in your hometown the things we've heard that you did at Capernaum. And he said, truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, Jesus says, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land, and yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to the widow at Zarephath in Sidon. And there were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed, except Naaman the Syrian. When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. Then they got up, drove him out of town, and led Jesus to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so they might hurl him off the cliff. Okay, that's the rest of the story. But, whoa, Nellie, what is going on here? How do you go in just 6 verses from the men in the synagogue thinking these warm, fuzzy thoughts about Jesus' boy to them wanting to kill him? What was it that Jesus did that made them so angry? And what does that tell us about Jesus and the true nature of God? Well, I've heard a lot of sermons preached on this text. I was raised by evangelicals, and this was one of our favorite texts. And most of those sermons that I heard tried to answer the question by pointing to verse 21 when Jesus says, today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. And they interpret the text to mean that when Jesus read about the year of the Lord's favor and God's coming kingdom, and then he says the scripture is fulfilled, what that meant was he was claiming that he, Jesus, was the Messiah. And the angry response came from the pious Jews who were unwilling to consider that possibility. And they heard his words as blasphemy, heresy. And this interpretation fits neatly into the kind of Christian worldview that thinks Christianity is superior to Judaism. And the contention is that because the Jews rejected Jesus' claim to be Messiah, God's affection and loyalty is now with us, the currently chosen people, the Christians, and not anymore with the Jews who were his formerly chosen people. I have a lot of problems with that view, with that interpretation. One of them is that it has fed into anti-Semitic attitudes and actions by Christians throughout the centuries that have been just horrible. But also, it just isn't what the text says. Jesus doesn't say, I am the Messiah. And when the crowd tries to throw him off the cliff, they don't say, death to the false Messiah claimant. The people do get really mad, but I don't think that's why. I think the people get angry with Jesus that day for 2 reasons. And the first is because of where he stopped when he was reading the scripture. Our text tells us that Jesus reads from the prophet Isaiah. That passage we find in our Bibles in Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2. Maybe some slight differences in translation, but essentially the message is the same there. The proclamation of good news for people who are suffering. The announcement of the year of Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor. And after he reads that verse, Luke tells us, Jesus rolls up the scroll and pronounces, this is completed. We're done with this, and hands it off. But if you look at that passage in Isaiah, you see something really interesting. If he had just read one phrase further than what he did, The Isaiah prophecy does proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and, the next line, the day of vengeance of our God. And the men in the synagogue knew that prophecy. And I think they were startled when Jesus stopped where he did, proclaiming the year of Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor, and pronounced it complete. They knew what came next in the prophecy. And not only did they know it, but I'm guessing that was their favorite part of the prophecy. Their expectation was that when Messiah comes, it will be the day of liberation for the oppressed, yes, but it will also be the day of reckoning, when all their enemies were going to be punished by one very angry, very powerful God. And this was a belief that they thought helped make life worth living. You know, you can put up with a lot of pain and suffering right now if you know that someday those people who did you bad are going to get theirs. All of us good people who are down now will be lifted up, and by golly, all of those evil sinners are going to get what they deserve. Vengeance, revenge, payback. It's going to be great. But then Jesus comes along. He reads the part about the good news and the liberation, and he stops. And Jesus says, we'll just close the book right there, and puts it away. He left out the vengeance part. He left out the best part, as far as his listeners were concerned, and that's what made him angry. And if people are getting angry in the story about Jesus leaving out that vengeance part, that helps to explain just how angry they get with the next things that he says. In the days of Elijah, Jesus says, God didn't send Elijah to minister to the starving women in Israel. He sent Elijah to help the widow at Zarephath. And Elisha wasn't sent by God to help the lepers in Israel, Jesus says. God directed Elisha to minister to Naaman the Syrian. And when Jesus said that, the crowd went nuts. They didn't want to hear somebody talking about their God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, being gracious to other nations and other people. To suggest that the God of Israel cares for the people in Zarephath, or the Syrians? Are you kidding me? They hated those people. They were Gentiles. They were pagans. Israel had suffered at the hands of some of these people. And one of the tenets of their faith was that one day God's wrath was going to be poured out on all of those despicable people, and that they, the long-suffering, faithful Israelites, were going to get to enjoy the show. Jesus' listeners thought of God in much the same way that many Christians today think about God, as our God, who one day is going to come and reward us, and will angrily exact vengeance on all of our enemies. And Jesus steps into that crowd, he steps into that way of thinking, and he says, I'm here to tell you, you have projected too many of your own feelings, too much of your own anger, too much of your own taste for revenge onto God. I'm here to tell you, Jesus says, God is not about anger and wrath and revenge. I'm here to tell you that God is about love and grace and mercy. God is about restoring and reconciling and repairing. God is about healing and building up. And that God's love is for everyone, not just our tribe, not just our nation, not just our faith, not just our culture. So we can put a period right here, Jesus says, and close the scroll and stop projecting our revenge fantasies onto God. And the people listening to Jesus that day just didn't want to hear it. A lot of Christians don't want to hear that message today either. In our Christian tradition, we have a long history of thinkers who have produced libraries filled with books, sermons, and theology that celebrate just how awesome it's going to be when we are rewarded with an eternity of heavenly bliss. And that part of the joy of heaven is going to be the privilege of looking down and being entertained by the torment of all our enemies in hell. Peter Lombard, a 12th century scholastic theologian, wrote about the elect seeing the torments of the impious, seeing which they will not be grieved, but will be satiated with joy at the sight of their unutterable calamity. Martin Luther was once asked if it would make him sad to see people he loved in this life tortured for eternity in the next life. And he said, "Not in the least." In 1732, a Scottish preacher, Thomas Boston, described how God will hold sinners with one hand over the pit of hell while he torments them with the other. And God shall not pity them, but laugh at their calamity. And the righteous company in heaven shall rejoice in the execution of God's judgment, and shall sing while the smoke riseth up forever. Boston's contemporary, the 18th century American theologian Jonathan Edwards had this to say: "The view of the misery of the damned will double the ardor of the love and gratitude of the saints in heaven. The sight of hell torments will exalt the happiness of the saints forever." There's a verse from an old Isaac Watt hymn that I don't recall us singing recently, but it goes like this: "What bliss will fill the ransomed souls when they in glory dwell, to see the sinner as he rolls in quenchless flames of hell." Nice, huh? There are paintings and literary descriptions of the saints leaning over the balcony of heaven so they can get a better view of the torments of the sinners in hell down below. And I'm not just talking ancient history. An April 22, 2002 issue of Christianity Today, the Christian writer J.I. Packer assures us that love and pity for hell's occupants will not enter into our hearts. As long as there have been religions, people have used religions as a safe place in which they can indulge their revenge fantasies and feed their anger. When Jesus said that God is all about love and forgiveness and mercy, not about hate and anger and revenge, his listeners were enraged. He was threatening to take away one of the things they liked the best about their religion, the way it allowed them to feel superior to others, and to feel righteous about their desires to see other people hurt. But as we come to the reveal in the rest of the story of this morning's text, what does it show us about the nature of God? We believe that in Jesus, in his words and example and actions, we see the fullest, most accurate revelation we have of who and what God is all about. And how does Jesus tell us to think about our enemies? Well, Jesus says we're supposed to love our enemies. How does Jesus say we should think about people who hurt us? Well, he says we should pray for them and do good to them. How does Jesus think about those who choose paths of evil, whose own choices and actions are leading them to destruction? Does he look forward to the day they will suffer punishment? Does he relish and celebrate the thought of their coming anguish? No. When Jesus contemplates the coming destruction for the wicked, he weeps and he laments. He says, if you, even you, could only recognize on this day the things that make for peace. So the people gathered in the synagogue on the morning in our text story did not have ears to hear what Jesus was saying. They didn't have the kind of vision that could see past their own fears, their own anger and hatred and prejudice, and catch a glimpse of a world in which we are all brothers and sisters, in which we are all broken and flawed, but all loved and all forgiven. Do we have the ears and the eyes to hear and see what Jesus was revealing to us about the nature of God and God's love? This is the good news that Jesus proclaimed. This is the good news that we are to proclaim in Jesus' name, that there is a very special kind of love at work in the universe, that God is love, and we are here to be God's hands and feet in this world.
that